Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on planning schedule, Part 3. Now it's time to estimate activity durations. This process is called simply Estimate Activity Durations and has as its main outputs the duration estimates and, as goes along with every estimate, a basis of estimates. One of the key concepts you should keep in mind as you have durations of activities estimated is that these estimates should come from the person on the project team who is most familiar with the nature of the work in these specific activities. That way, you will get estimates that are much more reliable. If you have someone else estimate them, they should at least be someone who is familiar with this type of work. But it's even better if you can have the people who will be working on it do the estimates. You'll need to have a thorough understanding of the scope of work. Looking at the work package and the descriptions of the activities will help you to understand the scope of work. You'll also need to see if there are any constraints that are imposed on the duration. Some of these may be external constraints that you're required to finish something in a certain amount of time, or they may be natural constraints that certain processes take a certain amount of time to complete, no matter what you do. You'll need to review the resources that you'll need for this kind of work and what their skill levels are. You may also be constrained by how you schedule these resources depending on what kind of resources they are and what's available to you. Sometimes certain resources are only available for certain fixed durations of time, and you may have to budget based on that. You may not have much flexibility to lengthen or shorten that duration. More commonly, you'll find that activities depend on the level of effort, and that if you put more people on it, sometimes you can get it done faster. In other cases, you have only a certain number of resources. You may have only one or two of a certain type of resource, and you can't feasibly get more, and so you have to schedule based on those limitations. As you estimate how many resources you have available, that will drive the duration of your activity. You'll also need to take a look at your resource calendars, as some resources will be available only at certain times, and their availability may differ substantially from one resource to another or from one resource type to another. The amount of effort that you apply to the activity can affect its duration, but sometimes you can't speed things up or slow things down, or if you can, there's usually some overhead involved that causes it to be less than straightforward in how much you can adjust the duration of this project, of this activity. And finally, your durations can be affected by the different type of network analysis techniques that you use. We'll cover some of the more common network analysis techniques in a few slides. The law of diminishing returns will apply to your activity durations. If you have an activity that is expected to take 10 days with one person working on it, and you think that you can get it done in 5 days by adding 2 people, then you may think that by putting 4 people on it, you can get it done in 2.5 days, and so on until you can get it done in an hour. But it usually doesn't quite work that way. The more you try to squeeze things or adjust things, the more your efforts return less and less progress. Eventually, in fact, not only are the results nonlinear, but eventually they're negative, meaning that adding more people or resources to a task can actually make it take longer. Why would it make it take longer? Well, because you have so much more overhead when it comes to communication among team members, and because new team members need to be trained up and brought up to speed on the work that's being done. a lot of reasons why the law of diminishing returns applies when you try to compress activity durations. Sometimes you can speed things up by taking advantage of certain advances in technology. You'll have to figure out how this affects the resources you need and your costs, but sometimes advances in technology, particularly in improved quality and improved processes, can speed things up without it actually costing more. Sometimes it can cost less. As a project manager, you should also be aware that the motivation of your staff can play a factor in how long activities take. In particular, there are a couple of factors that you can also play a big part in. One is student syndrome or procrastination. This, of course, is the idea that you have an assignment, such as a report, that's due at the end of a certain period of time, and it's quite common to delay or procrastinate working on that activity until closer to its due date. Parkinson's law is the idea that work tends to expand to fill the time available. A task that's given a week to do could take 2 weeks if you give it 2 weeks. Ways that you can mitigate these problems of student syndrome and Parkinson's law are that you can decompose your tasks and activities into smaller pieces so that it's easier to manage different priorities. And another is to make sure that your staff are only working on one thing at a time, each person having only one activity that they're working on. If you find that someone gets blocked on an activity and they need to work on another one, then take that activity off of their plate and let them focus on the one that they can be working on. If you find that you're getting blocked on activities a lot, it may be that what you need to do is break down these activities into smaller pieces so that you can accomplish parts of them and mark them done and get them finished, rather than having them put on hold all the time. As a project manager, you can have a huge effect in managing and preventing these kinds of problems by scheduling your project appropriately. Rather than trying to memorize all of the inputs to the estimate activity durations process, instead, think about what you need to estimate activity durations. You'll need to start off with the outputs of the previous process. So start with the activity list. This is what you're going to be estimating. You'll also need the activity attributes so that you have some details about the activities. These will also include links and relationships amongst these activities back to the work breakdown structure, which leads you to the next input, the scope baseline, particularly the work breakdown structure and WBS dictionary that include all sorts of technical details that will help you in understanding what is involved in each of these activities so that you can estimate the durations accurately. The milestone list is also valuable because you may have certain dates that are forced upon you, and that can restrict or constrain some of the durations of activities, and you'll need to adjust your resources appropriately to meet those milestone dates. Which leads you to the next one. You'll need to take a look at your resource requirements and your resource breakdown structure, your project team assignments, and your resource calendars, all of these things that have to do with your resources and their availability. These can affect how long activities will take to complete. You may also find some interesting information in the assumption log, the risk register, and the lessons learned register that could affect your activities. And as this is a schedule planning process, you'll need to follow the guidelines that are put together in the schedule management plan. And as always, you have some enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets as inputs. Let's start with the list of enterprise environmental factors that can influence estimate activity durations. First of all, you may be fortunate enough in your organization to have some databases and other data in your organization about durations of activities of previous projects. And if these are activities that are similar, you may be able to use this information to guide your estimates of the activity durations for your project. In addition, you may have some productivity metrics that will help you understand the productivity of individual team members, as well as physical assets and other resources that you need for your project. And you can use these productivity metrics to estimate how long it will take for these resources and people to complete these activities. In addition, you may be able to use some published commercial information that has details about how long certain activities tend to take. At the very least, this could be useful information to compare to your organization's data on how long it takes to complete these sorts of activities. And you can do a little bit of baselining to see whether your organization is more or less productive than average. Also, the location of your team members can affect how long activities take to complete. If your team members are in different locations, the environment that they're in can affect their productivity. The need to collaborate with other team members can also be a factor. And so don't forget to consider the location of your team members and other resources. And now we come to the organizational process assets that can affect your estimate activity durations process. Notice the first one on the list is historical duration information. We just covered this in the previous slide on enterprise environmental factors as duration estimating databases and data. You'll see this kind of overlap sometimes in the PMBOK guide between enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. This can be a little confusing, but in general, if you try to see it as the enterprise environmental factors is more the tool, so the estimating databases, because it's a tool that falls under enterprise environmental factor. But the knowledge itself and knowledge repositories are normally listed as part of the organizational process assets. So depending on how you're looking at this, whether you're looking at the information, which is an organizational process asset, or you're looking at the tool, which is a duration estimating database or estimating tools that belong in enterprise environmental factors, that can determine whether it's listed in this group or the other group or both. In this case, you can see that it's represented somewhat in both of these lists. Either way, it can be helpful for your project to consult this historical information about durations and other lessons learned in the Lessons Learned repository. You also have project calendars from previous projects. You have estimating policies of your organization, which can guide you in the different tools and techniques that you should be using on your project. And your organization may have or recommend certain scheduling methodologies. And now we come to some of the interesting tools and techniques used to estimate activity durations. The three primary techniques are analogous estimating, parametric estimating, and bottom-up estimating. Analogous estimating is when you determine your estimates based on a similar project, and usually taken as a whole. So for example, if you say, we did a project a lot like this last year, and it took us 3 months, and this project is a lot like that one as far as its complexity and what we're trying to accomplish, and how much work we have to do. It looks like it might be a little bit more, so we'll guess that it's about 4 months to do this one. That's a type of analogous estimate. A parametric estimate is based on strict formulas. One example would be estimating the cost to build a house. If houses of this level and quality are normally costing about $100 per square foot, then you can simply use this formula to calculate what this house will cost. If the house has 1,000 square feet, or 2,000 square feet, or 3,000 square feet, whatever it is, you can multiply that by the cost per square foot to come up with an estimate of how much the house will cost to build. Formulas like this for estimating activity durations are known as parametric estimating. Bottom-up estimating is when you individually estimate each task, each activity, one by one, and then just sum it all up. 3-point estimating is a technique that I highly recommend. It can be used with all of the other forms of estimating we just covered, analogous, parametric, or bottom-up. In 3-point estimating, you come up with 3 estimates for each activity or work package or whatever it is you're estimating. The key is to come up with 3 estimates. Your most likely, your optimistic, and your pessimistic estimates. So suppose you have an activity and you're working with the person on your team who's going to be doing this activity, and you ask them to estimate this activity, and they say, well, it's probably going to take about a week. Then you ask them, is that your most likely estimate? You think it's most likely going to take a week? And they say, yes. Then you ask them, if everything goes well, what's the soonest you think it could reasonably be done? And he says, well, it could be done in 4 days, if everything goes well, rather than 5. That's then your optimistic estimate. And then you say, well, what if things don't go so well? What if there are lots of problems along the way? Consider some of the risks involved in this particular task, and how long might it take if things don't go so well? And they say, well, it could take as much as 2 weeks, a full 10 days, if things don't go so well. And that's your pessimistic estimate. Now that you have these 3 estimates of 5 days, 4 days, and 10 days, you now use these numbers in this formula. There are a couple of different variations of this. There are actually several, but a couple that are presented here and that are most common are the triangular distribution and the beta distribution. In the triangular distribution, you're assuming basically that each of these outcomes is equally likely. It's just as equally likely that it'll be the optimistic or pessimistic or most likely durations. So you simply add those up and do a simple average. In the beta distribution, you're assuming that it's not so likely that your optimistic or pessimistic estimates are accurate, that you think your most likely estimate is the one that's most likely going to happen. And so you favor that one by multiplying that estimate by 4, adding in the other 2 estimates of optimistic and pessimistic, and then dividing the whole thing by 6. Then that gives you, in each of those cases, your expected estimate, represented here by E. Not only does 3-point estimating help you to balance out your estimates and to have a better estimate as a result, it also helps you to identify any risks to these estimates. If, for example, you find that the pessimistic estimate is 2 or 3 times longer than the most likely estimate, that tells you there's some significant risk involved in this particular activity. And it's worth spending some time with your team members to explore these risks and see if you can better understand this activity and if there are any opportunities to mitigate these risks. Let's walk through a simple example of using these formulas. Let's suppose you have an activity and you meet with the team members and collaborate with them, and the consensus is that this is something that's probably going to take 2 days to do. It could take as little as 1 day if things go really well. Or it could take as much as 4 days if things don't go so well. First, you put this into your triangular formula. You add them together and divide by 3. It's a simple average. You end up with 2.33 days, 2 1/3 days. You can also use the beta formula, which favors the most likely estimate over the other estimates by multiplying it by 4, and then add that to the other two estimates, divide by 6. Then you have 2.17 days. Notice that this is a little bit shorter because, unlike the triangular distribution, it isn't giving as much weight to this pessimistic estimate, which is twice as long as the most likely estimate. The triangular and beta distributions are not the only ones you can use. You can use whatever makes sense for your particular project and for the particular activities that you're considering. Some activities may naturally have different distributions, and your experience may tell you that there is more risk in certain types of activities. In my case, whenever I'm managing a software development project, I find that those types of projects are much riskier and that the pessimistic estimate needs more of an emphasis. So it's not uncommon for me to take these 3 estimates and then average together the most likely and pessimistic and throw away the optimistic altogether. Because really, in software development, how often does everything work so well that you hit your optimistic estimates? It almost never happens. Usually you're somewhere between your initial guess and your pessimistic guess. Also, keep in mind that you need to distinguish when you're asking for estimates, whether you're asking for ideal time or real time. In other words, if someone gives you an estimate that something's going to take 2 days to do, is that 2 days with no interruptions, no meetings, no surprises, none of the other things that have to go on? 2 days worth of effort? Or more likely, it's going to take more than 2 days to actually get it done because of all of these interruptions. And so you may want to factor in these different interruptions using an adjustment or a multiplier. You may want to take these estimates once you've run through all the numbers and say, you know what, we spend a certain amount of our time in meetings and other interruptions, so I'm going to multiply all this by another 50%. And so this 2-day estimate is going to become a 3-day estimate. This 4-day estimate will become a 6-day estimate, and so on. There are also 2 data analysis tools that are part of the estimate activity durations process. These are alternatives analysis and reserve analysis. Alternatives analysis comes into play because as you're estimating activity durations, you'll need to consider the different resources that you have available to you and make decisions in comparing alternatives about whether you're going to use higher level resources or lower level resources with different skill levels, which types of tools are you going to use, and what is the different durations that these activities will take based on the tools that you use. These resources and tools, are you going to make them, or you're going to rent them, or you're going to buy them? When it comes to team members, are you going to use in-house people, or will you hire some people to come in and on a staff aug basis add people to your team temporarily? Or do you need to hire more people long term and bring them into your organization and onto your project in that way? You'll also be considering alternative ways to compress the schedule and making some decisions based on your analysis of options of schedule compression. Reserve analysis is all about dealing with the uncertainty. As we saw with 3-point estimating, we make an attempt to measure some of the uncertainty in these estimates, and that uncertainty can be accounted for in your contingency reserve. Your expected duration, based on your formula calculations, may come out to be a certain number, but you may also want to look at that pessimistic estimate and use some of that to allocate a little bit of reserve. You may want to put in a little bit of buffer of a day or two or a certain amount for each activity or a certain percentage for each activity, depending on your pessimistic estimates. Contingency reserves are specifically for your identified risks on the project. There are also management reserves. These are for your unforeseen risks, what they sometimes call the unknown unknowns. There are certain things that are risky and you may not have identified the particular risks involved, but things can happen. And so that's what the management reserve is for. As you do all these estimates with your team members and others, you'll be meeting a lot with people, so that's on your list of tools and techniques. And of course, you'll be making a lot of decisions. And so you'll need to consider the different decision-making tools you have, including voting and voting methods that you will use to make some of these decisions. How much do you remember of the inputs, outputs, and tools and techniques of the estimate activity durations process? Start with the outputs. Can you remember what the primary outputs are? Then think about the inputs that would be valuable for that. In particular, think about the process that precedes this one and what its outputs are. And then think about the tools and techniques that you can use to generate those outputs. Here are the lists. The main outputs are the duration estimates, and don't forget your basis of estimates, so that there's some documentation of exactly how you came up with these estimates. In other words, did you use parametric estimating? Did you use analogous estimating? 3-point estimating? Did you use a triangular versus a beta distribution? And which of these did you use on which activities and which work packages? Because it can be different for different work packages. Also, take a look at the inputs that you would use to create these durations. Looking at your previous process generated an activity list and activity attributes and a milestone list. So those are on your list here of project documents. Your lessons learned register is always going to be there. Your assumption log is often there as well, so it makes sense that that's there. But then you'll see there are a number of resource-related inputs, because you'll need to think about the resources you have available in order to come up with your durations. So your project team assignments, your resource breakdown structure, your resource calendars, and your resource requirements. Also, your risk register, which goes along with your assumptions log and your lessons learned register as a possible source of information that can influence your duration estimates. As this is a planning process, you will need to follow your rules for planning, which come from your schedule management plan. You also have your scope baseline here, because you may find some additional technical information in your WBS dictionary, for example, that can help you with your activity durations. And as always, there are enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets that can affect this, including things such as policies and templates and lessons learned repository and such. Coming back to your outputs, as you come up with your durations, this can affect some of these inputs that you've been looking at. In particular, your activity attributes could use a little tweaking. Your assumption log may need to be updated with new assumptions that you've come up with as you've been putting together your durations. And your lessons learned register, updated with information and learnings from estimating these activities. Now to our tools and techniques. Expert judgment is almost always on the list because you can use the help and advice of experts in estimating. And the techniques that we covered include analogous estimating, where you make a guess based on similar projects that you've done in the past. Parametric estimating, in which you use a formula such as cost per square foot. And you also have bottom-up estimating, in which you estimate each individual activity and add it all up from the bottom. We also covered 3-point estimating, in which you use optimistic, most likely, and pessimistic estimates and average those using different distributions. There'll be plenty of meetings, decisions that need to be made, and analysis of lots of different alternatives. And you'll also need to do some reserve analysis, particularly around contingency reserves that you should identify for individual risks, and these will be included in your cost baseline. This is the end of part 3. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.